Chapter 1 of The Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. The Giraffe Problem. Prefatory Note. The general public knows little about the Problem Club. Many are not even aware that it has now been in existence for several years. Nor can it be said that the references to it which have appeared from time to time in the press have been very enlightening or even reasonably accurate. For instance, a paragraph in a recent issue of a society paper, which, it may be admitted, is generally well informed, makes various statements as to the Problem Club. It says that the club has its premises underground in Piccadilly, that a former premier is a member of it, that all the members are required to swear a most solemn oath to act with scrupulous honour in the monthly competitions, and that high play frequently goes on. The actual truth is that there are no club premises. The famous but old-fashioned restaurant that reserves 2 rooms on the first floor for the club's monthly meetings is not situated in Piccadilly. No premier has ever been a member. The story of the solemn oath is even more absurd. After all, the members are gentlemen. They would as soon think of taking a solemn oath not to cheat at cards or at golf. The scrupulous honour is taken for granted. Lastly, there is no high play in the accepted sense of the term. The amount that a member can win or lose in the monthly competitions will be stated presently, and any betting on the results is prohibited. Silly misrepresentations of this kind have caused some annoyance, and it is now thought that a discreet but authorized account of some part of the proceedings of the club would be preferable. The club consists of 12 members, and the annual subscription is £134. Of this sum, £24 is allotted to the club expenses, including the club dinners which are held on the first Saturday in every month. Each member in turn acts as chairman at one dinner in the year, afterwards adjudicating upon the problem competition for that month, while at the other 11 meetings he is himself a competitor, the remaining £110 of his subscription being treated as 11 entrance fees of £10 each. The problems are not of a mathematical nature, and were for some time invented and propounded by Leonard, the ingenious head waiter of the restaurant. The winner receives the whole of the entrance fees, amounting to £110. If there is more than one winner, this amount is divided equally between them. Thus, for his investment of £110, it is possible that a member may in 1 year obtain a return of £1,210 if he is the sole winner of the 11 competitions for which he is eligible. But the minute books of the club show that in actual practice this has never happened. Indeed, the record, made by Mr. Pusely Smith in 1911, is 7 wins, and on 2 occasions out of the 7 he had to share the prize with another successful competitor. It may be admitted that the club has necessarily been of the nature of a secret society. Some of the problems set have been rather curious, and it has occasionally happened that in the course of their practical solution, members have been led to do things which might prejudice them in their domestic or social relations, or even subject them to the penalties of the law. It is permitted to add an account of some of the pre-war meetings of the club, various natural precautions being taken to prevent the discovery of the identity of members. It was the 43rd meeting of the Problem Club. Dinner was over, and the members had adjourned to the lofty and comfortable room where the business of the evening was transacted. A side table was suitably equipped with provision for smokers (all the members were smokers), and for such other refreshments as might be required in the course of the evening. 1 or 2 waiters still lingered, removing a coffee cup, handing a liqueur, or placing an ashtray and matches conveniently on one of the small tables. A hum of conversation went on through the blue haze of the cigar smoke. Mr. Pusely Smith, with his usual lugubrious manner, was just coming to the end of a screamingly funny story. Any reference to the competition to be settled is by an unwritten law forbidden until the chairman has opened the proceedings, but it was noticeable that Major Byles was once more talking of resigning his membership. He was not taken very seriously. He was an original member, and though he lived in the country for the greater part of the year, had never been known to miss a single meeting of the club. His continuous bad luck in the competitions had irritated him, but nobody believed in his threat of resignation, and it may be doubted if he quite believed in it himself. The waiters left the room, and Sir Charles Bunford, an elderly gentleman of distinguished appearance, who was chairman for the evening, took his place at his table and arranged his papers. Among them the club checkbook showed temptingly. In accordance with the club custom, by which the chairman at one meeting acted as secretary at the next, Dr. Alden took a seat beside Sir Charles and prepared to make a note of the proceedings for the club minute-book. Conversation ceased. The other members seated themselves informally in a semicircle of easy chairs. There was, indeed, a marked absence of formality at the Problem Club. There was no order of precedence. The chairman did not rise when he spoke, nor did members rise when they answered him. "Now, gentlemen," Sir Charles began, "we have before us tonight the giraffe problem. I will read it out to you as worded by our esteemed friend Leonard. It is required to induce a woman who is unaware of your intention to say to you, 'You ought to have been a giraffe.' Now, of course, I'm not a competitor, but I must say that I'm sorry I'm not. Upon my word, I don't think Leonard has ever given us anything quite so easy." There were several dissentient voices. "Not a bit of it." "Can't agree with you there, Bunford." "Wish I'd found it so." "Leonard knew what he was doing this time." "Oh, very well," said Sir Charles, smiling. "I should have thought there were a score of conversational openings to which the inevitable reply would be, 'You ought to have been a giraffe.' I may be wrong, but I still expect that the prize tonight will have to be divided between 4 or 5 of you. However, we'll see what luck you've had. I'll begin with you, Doctor, and then we go on in the direction of the sun and the wine." Dr. Alden shook his head. He had a strong head, an alert expression, and a bright eye. "No good," he said. "There was too much to do in Harley Street this month for me to be able to give the proper time to it. I made an attempt. It has probably cost me the esteem of an excellent woman. These excellent women never think you're serious except when you're joking. I gave her the chance to tell me I ought to have been a giraffe, but she never took it. Enough said. Try the next man." The next is our only Member of Parliament, Mr. Harding Pope. "Not competing this month," said Mr. Pope rather pompously. "My constituency has made great demands upon me, and I'm unable to defend my entrance fee. Fortunately, the pleasure of the company in which I find myself is worth far more." "That's all right," said Sir Charles warningly, "but don't get too slack. We've got a long waiting list. What about you, Major Byles?" "My usual luck," said the Major. "I worked the whole thing out completely, and made all the necessary preparations. I was down at my cottage at the time. I assure you that during the whole of breakfast one morning I talked about practically nothing except giraffes, and the way that they can pull down fruit from a tree, thanks to their thundering long necks. My wife, the children's governess, and Mrs. Heber, who was stopping with us, all heard me, though I can't say that they seemed particularly interested. Afterwards my wife and I were in the garden, and I pointed to a tree full of ripe cherries. "I like fruit," I said, "but I hate climbing trees." Now, considering the ground bait that I had been putting down at breakfast, I consider the betting was 10 to 1 that she would reply that I ought to have been a giraffe. Instead of that, she said that Wilkins would get them for me, and then seemed surprised that I was annoyed. A few minutes later I tried the governess with precisely the same remark, and she asked me if I would like to have a ladder fetched. I often wonder what I paid that woman her salary for. Then Mrs. Heber came out, as dependable a woman as I know in a general way. You nearly always know what she's going to say before she says it. And I told her that I liked cherries, but hated climbing to get them. "You ought," she began, and this time I thought I really had got it, "to be able to reach some of those without climbing." After that I gave up. No amount of intelligence can contend against luck like that. Matter of fact, I'm tempted to give up this problem business altogether. "Oh, don't do that," said Sir Charles soothingly. "It was hard lines, but we shall see you a prize winner one of these days. Now, Mr. Cunliffe, what have you to tell us?" "I failed," said the Reverend Septimus Cunliffe, an elderly cleric who specialized in broad-mindedness. "Plausible strategy, but disappointing results. Nothing of interest to report." "Did you do any better, Mr. Matthews?" Mr. Matthews was a man of 40, bald, round-faced, rubicund, and slightly obese. The task of ordering the club dinners and the wines to be drunk therewith was always left in his hands with a confidence which was invariably justified. His knowledge as an epicure was considerable, and it is possible that his intelligence was less considerable, but more than once he had been lucky in a competition. He was the richest man in a club where nobody was very poor, and was good-tempered and popular. "Well, you know," said Matthews, "I feel as if I ought to have won this. At one time it looked as if I simply had it chucked at me. I was talking to Lady Amelia, who does a lot in the East End and is always nosing round for subscriptions. "Why do you men drink?" she asked in her blunt way. The question of this competition occurred to me, and it looked like a good chance. "Well," I said, "the pleasure begins in the palate, but I fancy that it continues in the throat. I often wish I had a longer throat." You would have hardly thought she could have missed it, but she did. Said that she was sure I was not so bad as I made myself out to be, and milked me of a fiver for some rotten "good cause." "Look here," said Major Byles, returning from a fruitless visit to the side table. "I'll ask the chairman for a minute's interval. They've not put out any seltzer, though they must know that I always take seltzer with mine." "Certainly, Major, certainly. Would somebody kindly touch the bell?" The seltzer water was brought and business was resumed. "Your turn next, Jimmy," said Sir Charles. The Honourable James Feldane, a rather wary young man, said, "Well, I claim to be a winner, but there's a shade of doubt about it, and I'll ask for your ruling. All I can say is that if I don't touch the money, my luck's even worse than the Major's. Like him, I was systematic about it. My first step was to buy some of the highest collars that could be got for money, 2 inches or so too high for me and beastly uncomfortable. I put one of them on, and looked like a bad freak, something out of a back number of Punch. My next step was to call on my married sister. She told me to go home and dress myself properly, as I knew she would. So I asked in my innocent way what was wrong, and she said I seemed to have mistaken my neck for the Nelson column. "Alluding to my collar?" I said. "Well, I like plenty. I'd wear a collar 3 feet high if I could." And then my fool of a brother-in-law stuck his oar in, and said, "You ought to have been a giraffe," and I'm absolutely certain Dora would have said it if he hadn't got in first. So there it is, the words were all right, but they were used by a man. Still, for some purposes, bankruptcy and things of that kind, a man and his wife count as one, don't they? What's the ruling? "My ruling," said Sir Charles, "is that your claim fails. It is required that the words should be used by a woman, and your brother-in-law is not a woman." "Yes, I was afraid you'd think so," said Jimmy, "but it was worth trying. Anybody want any rotten high collars?" "Now, Mr. Pusely-Smythe," said the chairman. Mr. Pusely-Smythe was a man of middle age, with dark cavernous eyes and an intellectual forehead. He was pale and thin, and was less solemn than he seemed. "I claim to have won," he said in a melancholy voice. "My method was not the most obvious or direct, and might easily have failed, but the luck was with me. I must tell you that I happen to know a Mrs. Magsworth, who of late years has given way a good deal to nature study. She haunts the zoo and the botanical gardens. She understands about the habitat of the hyena, and if cockroaches devour their young, and which end of the tree the onion grows. All that kind of thing. She is rather severe with people who, as she phrases it, show an abysmal ignorance of the simplest facts. She has got a face like a horse, although that is not germane to the question. I arranged with a kindly hostess to let me take in Mrs. Magsworth to dinner one evening. I gathered that there was no particular rush for the job. I said, "I'm so glad to meet you again, Mrs. Magsworth. With your knowledge you will be able to settle a point that has been worrying me for days. My little nephew asked me which was the tallest animal, and, do you know, I couldn't be quite sure." "Then, Mr. Smith," she said, "you ought to have been. A giraffe is much the tallest of the mammals." So I claim to have won. She, being a woman ignorant of my intention, was induced to say to me the words required in the order required and without the interpolation of any other word. "But there's the interpolation of a full stop," said Mr. Harding Pope, and was at once called to order. Only the chairman has the right to comment and to adjudicate. Sir Charles took a few moments to consider his decision, and then gave his ruling as follows. "My ruling is that Mr. Pusely-Smythe's claim is conditionally allowed. It is true that Mrs. Magsworth used other words both before and after the words required, but that is not precluded by the terms of the problem. The only other possible objection is that there was the interpolation of a full stop. Now, there is no full stop in spoken speech. It is represented by a pause. In this case, the pause indicated the end of a sentence. In another case, the pause might have indicated that the woman could not for a moment think of the word giraffe. In that case, I am sure that no objection would have been raised. Yet there too, a sign could be used to represent it in print or writing. Leonard requires certain words in a certain order, but he does not forbid a pause to be made between them. Unless some member has induced the woman to use the same words with no pause whatever, which I should rule to be a still better solution, Mr. Pusely-Smith's claim is allowed. As no other member had met with any success at all, a cheque for £110 was drawn to the order of Mr. Pusely-Smith and handed to him with the congratulations of the chairman. The chairman's next duty was to open the sealed envelope containing the problem set by the ingenious Leonard for the ensuing month. This was entitled The Kiss Problem, and when its conditions were read out, both Major Byles and the Reverend Septimus Cunliffe objected to it, though on totally different grounds, and urged that Leonard should be asked to substitute something else. However, on a vote being taken, it was agreed by a considerable majority that The Kiss Problem should be retained, although, as the chairman pointed out, it looked excessively dangerous. Mr. Pusely-Smith was reminded that it was his turn to be chairman at the next meeting, and then, the business of the evening being at an end, the card tables were brought in, and members addressed themselves to bridge at moderate points. End of The Giraffe Problem.
Chapter 2 of the Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dahlman. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. The Kiss Problem. Mr. Pusely-Smith's air of saturnine melancholy was pronounced as he took the chair at the 44th monthly meeting of the Problem Club. "Well, gentlemen," he began, "the waiters are supposed to have left the room, but in view of the nature of the problem before us to-night, you would probably wish to be quite sure on the point. Will someone kindly examine the screen by the waiter's entrance?" Mr. Quillian, K.C., reported that no waiter was concealed, and further that the door was locked. "Thank you, my learned friend. Leonard, admirable as a head waiter, ingenious and generally innocuous as the inventor of our problems, has on this occasion undergone a moral lapse. I will give you the words of this lamentable problem. It is required within the space of 1 hour to kiss upon the cheek 10 females of the age of courtship, and not cousins or any nearer relative of the kisser, without giving offence to any one of them. Major Byles protested against this problem on the grounds that it gave an unfair advantage to the young and unattached. The Reverend Septimus Cunliffe seconded the protest on the ground that, broad-minded though he was, after all there was a limit. A vote being taken, it was found, to the eternal shame of the club, if I may say so, that there was a considerable majority in favour of the problem being retained. Every member being well aware that the chairman himself had voted with the majority, there was some hilarious interruption. "Gentlemen," said the chairman severely, "this is not the spirit in which to approach stories of wrecked homes and blasted reputations. And these stories we must now hear. I observe that Mr. Quillian has had his face scratched recently, doubtless the work of outraged modesty. But before I really must protest," said Mr. Quillian. "The slight marks on my left cheek are not scratches, but were caused, as they say at the inquest, by some blunt instrument, to wit, a safety razor." "Well," the chairman continued, "you will have an opportunity later to explain how the girl got hold of the razor. I will begin with some of our younger Lothlorios. What have you to tell us, Mr. Feldane?" The Honourable James Feldane put down his cigarette, and spoke wearily. "It's like this, you know. I claim to have won unless my score's beaten. 10 in an hour is an impossible demand on the part of our friend Leonard, and I doubt if bogey would be more than 4. May I take it that I win if I'm the nearest to Leonard's figure?" That is so. Continue your loathsome confessions. It's strictly Masonic and all that, ain't it? Mr. Feldine may be assured that his hideous secret will die with us, said the chairman. The club rule of secrecy has never yet been broken. That being so, I'll get on. I'd planned it all for a dance I was going to, and I put in a deal of conscientious preliminary work, getting certain girls up to a certain mark, if you understand what I mean. On the appointed night, a perfectly dear old thing with 2 daughters, some years older than myself, called to take me on to that dance. They've known me all my life. They knew me when I'd got golden curls and played with a wool rabbit. They're no sort of relation, and so they count for the purpose of this competition. Well, I've always kissed them when we meet, and I kissed them that time as soon as I boarded the car. So when we got to the house where the dance was, I was 3 up, and still had 53 minutes to go. Here Feldane was interrupted by an appeal to the chairman. It was made by his friend Hesseltine, a tall and dark young man, as good-looking as Feldane himself, though a very different type. "Mr. Chairman," said Hesseltine, "before Jimmy goes any further, I should like to ask for your ruling. The mother of those 2 girls is to my certain knowledge 62 years of age. I claim that Jimmy cannot score her, as she is above the age of courtship." "Sorry, Mr. Hesseltine, but your claim is disallowed. It has been well observed that a man is as old as he feels, but that a woman is rather younger than she doesn't look. There is no historical instance of any woman being over the age of courtship." "Then I'm pipped," said Hesseltine gloomily. "Go on, Jimmy." "I kissed 4 more in the time that left me, but one of them told me that she would never speak to me again, and so I can't count her, though that's what she always says. I was done by the time limit. You can't in decency kiss a girl and then do an immediate bunk. You must keep on telling her how maddeningly beautiful she is for a few minutes. Besides, at a dance you can't always find the girl that you want at the moment you want her. Still, I claim a score of 6. The claim is allowed. And what is your sad experience, Mr. Hesseltine?" "Much the same as Jimmy's. I went to the same dance. I also played the friends of my childhood, but I could only raise 5 of them, so Jimmy's one ahead. If you had disallowed his old lady, we should have tied. I might add that, being rather carried away, I got engaged to 2 different girls in the course of the hour. And though it's all right now, I don't monkey with a buzzsaw again. The next kiss problem will find little Bobby seated with the spectators." "Possibly," said the chairman. "The finesse and experience of riper years will have accomplished more than the attractions of untutored youth. May I interrupt your secretarial duties, Sir Charles?" Sir Charles laid down his pencil, smiled, and shook his head. "This time you must place me also with the spectators," he said, and quoted an apt line from Horace. "It's seldom that you miss. I wish, Mr. Harding Pope, that I could say the same of you. What have you done this time to redeem yourself?" "What could I do?" said Mr. Pope, with an oratorical gesture. "I represent a nonconformist constituency that will not tolerate the least laxity in the private life of its member. The mere suspicion that I had taken part in a competition of this kind might end my political career." "Possibly. Failure to take part in the next competition will actually end your career as a member of this club, as you will see if you refer to Rule 11. The club does not regard onlookers as sportsmen. I suppose, Major Byles, since you protested against the problem, that for the first time in your membership you have failed to compete." "That is so, but my protest had very little to do with it. Matter of fact, I had a superstitious idea that it might change my luck if I gave a miss this time." "Then I will turn to Dr. Alden. What was your adventure, doctor?" "Mine was more of a tragedy than an adventure," said the doctor. "On the evening of Sunday the 12th, acting on information received, I presented myself at the residence of my married sister. She said that I must have forgotten that she was entertaining the girls of her Tennyson Club that night, and that she had never wanted me less, but that, as I was there, I could stop. I stopped, that being what I had come for. Her suggestion that her husband and myself, the only 2 males present, should go off in the billiard room after supper, was negatived by both of us. In accordance with plan, I then directed the conversation to the subject of face powder, condemning it on scientific grounds, and maintaining that it deceived nobody. My sister said that it was not intended to deceive, but that, as a matter of fact, no man would ever detect it unless it had been put on with a shovel. I said that, on the contrary, given a certain condition, any man with a scientific training could detect it with his eyes shut. Several of the girls asked me how. This was not unexpected. I replied that he would only have to touch his lips to the cheek on which there was face powder, and he would know it instantly and infallibly. My sister said she did not believe a word of it. My answer was I could easily prove it. Let them blindfold me. Then 12 times in succession let a cheek touch my lips. In each case I would state whether or not face powder had been used, and would employ no other means of detection. I was so certain of it that I would gladly contribute a guinea to the charitable fund of the Tennyson Club for every mistake I made. My sister said that it was very easy to make an impossible offer that could not be accepted. Somewhat to my surprise, the prettiest girl there said that she did not think it an impossible offer at all. It was a scientific experiment and might benefit a very good cause. I would never know the identity of the 12 who took part in the experiment. Its very publicity made it innocuous. But I should have to give them a little time to settle which of the 12 were to be sacrificed and the order in which they were to present themselves. To this I at once agreed. I was put in a chair and blindfolded. Really blindfolded. I need hardly to tell the members of this club that my claim to be able to detect the presence of face powder in the way indicated was a piece of monumental spoof. This did not alarm me. I could not lose more than 12 guineas, and I was out to win our prize of £110. I could assign my mistakes to the fact that I had just smoked a cigarette, thus spoiling the delicacy of my perception. I heard a sound of whispering and suppressed laughter as the girls held their consultation, and then the experiment began in silence, broken only by the rustle of feminine garments. 12 times in succession I felt a gentle touch upon my lips, and never once did I fail to take advantage of it. I gave 6 decisions for face powder and 6 against, and was just thinking how I would spend the £110 when I heard a roar of laughter. I tore off the bandage and asked what was the matter. As soon as they could speak, they told me. The only person I had kissed on all 12 occasions was my own sister. Sometimes she had touched my lips with her cheek, on which there was face powder, and sometimes with the back of her hand, on which there was none. And 9 times I had been mistaken in my diagnosis. The treasurer of the charitable fund, she was the pretty girl of whom I have spoken, collected the money. And then they all resumed their merriment, and no excuse for my mistakes was ever heard. All things considered, I think I have a fair claim for the consolation prize. The club does not give prizes of that description, said the chairman, but I can offer you our sympathy, which is more valuable than mere money. I will now call on Mr. Quillian. Mr. Quillian adjusted his pince-nez. I will ask the chairman's permission to argue that the whole of this competition is null and void, and the prize should be added to that for the next competition. I will hear you, Mr. Quillian, but you must be brief and to the point. You are not in court now, you know. If you please, I submit that a kiss has a psychical as well as a physical side, and that kisses for competition purposes are so deficient on the psychical or emotional side that they cannot be considered as kisses in the ordinary sense of the word. I do not admit that. Possibly the competition kiss does not come up to the standard demanded by a voluptuary like my learned friend, but it is still a kiss. If he kissed this matchbox, it would be a kiss and could not be described otherwise, though presumably the emotional side would be absent. Enough of these legal quibbles. I will now ask Mr. Matthews if he has been as successful in the part of the Lothario as he invariably is in that of Lucullus. Mr. Matthews, the club epicure, said that a decent upbringing had caused him to fail in a shameful enterprise, and gave his account of it. He advertised in the name of Mrs. Elsmere Twiss, giving an accommodation address for the companion to an elderly lady. The salary offered was magnificent, and it was intimated that accomplishments would be less valued than youthful charm and an affectionate nature. Applicants were to enclose photographs. 10 of the applicants, and it is to be feared that they were the 10 whose photographs were most attractive, were given an appointment with Mrs. Elsmere Twist at a West End hotel on a certain day. On the morning of that day Mr. Matthews placed himself in the hands of a famous costumier, who had guaranteed to convert him into such an excellent imitation of an old lady that even at close quarters the disguise would not be detected. The costumier spent 2 hours on effecting a most artistic transformation, and then, after submitting himself to the photographer in attendance, Mr. Matthews drove off to the hotel. A passer-by who had happened to glance into the cab might have observed a sweet-looking old lady smoking a large cigar. He now proceeded to interview the selected 10, it being his abominable intention to kiss each applicant as he said good-bye to her. The first applicant to be brought in from the waiting-room was Miss Grace Porter. Everything went well until the moment came for the affectionate good-bye, but then it chanced that Miss Porter dropped her handkerchief. Now Mr. Matthews had from the nursery upward been taught habits of politeness, and his decent upbringing now proved his undoing. Forgetting that he was supposed to be an elderly lady and the girl's prospective employer, he flew to pick up that handkerchief, and as he stooped his hat and wig fell off. For a few moments he remained stooping, waiting for Miss Porter's scream. But no scream came. She had realized that Mrs. Elsmere Twist wore a wig, but not that she was a man, and that tactful Miss Porter had retired from the room. Mr. Matthews was safe, but his nerve was gone. He replaced the hat and wig and sent a waiter with a message to the remaining applicants. When Mr. Matthews had finished his story, 2 other members narrated how they had conspired together to get the game of Kiss in the Ring played at a rectory garden party and had failed miserably. "Now the only member left," said the chairman, "is Mr. Cunliffe, and he has protested against the problem, and will not have competed." "Pardon me," said the sonorous and ecclesiastical voice of the Reverend Septimus Cunliffe. "I have not only competed, but I claim to be the winner." "One moment. This is a shock, and some restorative seems indicated." The chairman fetched himself a brandy and soda from the side table, and resumed. "Now, if the reverend gentleman will continue the account of his exploits. It has pained me to hear to-night's aspirations on the character of our admirable Leonard. I admit that when I first heard the problem, I was myself inclined to misjudge him, but on examining it more closely, I saw that never had he risen to a higher pitch of austere, though cynical, morality. I saw that he intended that this prize should be won by the most high-minded member of the club, by a man whose mind was the least obsessed by thoughts of frivolity or flirtation. "Might I suggest," said the chairman, "that you should stop throwing bouquets to yourself and tell us about these 10 women that you have kissed?" "That's precisely my point. Leonard does not say women. He does not say girls. He says females. My aunt is interested in smoke-gray Persian cats. She breeds them and deals in them on behalf of a charity, and you will generally find 30 or 40 of them at her house. It is unhygienic to kiss cats, but I kissed 10 of them, and my aunt was greatly pleased at this unusual demonstration of affection for her pets. Some of them seemed slightly bored, but not one of them was offended. When a cat is offended, it tells you so. They were of an age for courtship by males of their own species. Briefly, the cats and I conformed in all respects with the requirements of the problem." "Gentlemen," said the chairman, "the subtlety of our theologian has overcome you. Our cheque for £110 will be drawn to the order of Mr. Septimus Cunliffe. I will now read out the problem which will next engage your attention. It is entitled the Free Meal Problem. It is required, within the space of 24 consecutive hours, to be the guest of 1 person at breakfast, of another at luncheon, and of a third at dinner, the host being in each case a person whom the competitor has not to his knowledge seen, and with whom he has held no communication previous to the sunrise preceding the meal. No direct request for a meal may be made, and no remuneration may be given in return for any meal. The adjudicator will be my learned friend, Mr. Quillian. End of the Kiss Problem.
Chapter 3 of the Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. Chapter 3. The Free Meal Problem. Probably no member of the Problem Club enjoyed his evening of chairmanship more than Mr. Quillian, K.C., who occupied the chair at the 45th meeting. He liked the position of authority, and he liked the opportunity to exercise the nicety and precision of his legal mind. In the free meal problem, on which he was to adjudicate, the ingenious head waiter Leonard had made the following demand. It is required within the space of 24 consecutive hours to be the guest of one person at breakfast, of another at luncheon, and of a third at dinner, the host being in each case a person whom the competitor has not to his knowledge seen, and with whom he has held no communication previous to the sunrise preceding the meal. No direct request for a meal may be made, and no remuneration may be given in return for any meal. "Now, gentlemen," said Mr. Quillian when he had read this out, "this is a problem where the question of definition may arise. For instance, a child in a railway carriage offers a traveller a small piece of deteriorated bun. We will suppose that the hour is 8 in the morning, and that the traveller has not partaken of food since the previous midnight. In the improbable event of his consuming the proffered dainty, he has undoubtedly broken his fast. But can he be said to have breakfasted? All I can say is that if the question of definition should arise to-night, I will do my best to deal with it on common-sense lines, accurately, but without pedantry." The chairman then called upon Mr. Wildersley, A.R.A., to give his experiences. Wildersley was a man of middle age, who, like many artists, retained something of the child in his composition. He was a big, good-tempered man of rather rugged appearance. The cigars provided by the club, good though they were, had no attraction for him. He was a pipe smoker, and between his sentences he contrived to keep his pipe alight. "Well," he said, "I mayn't be a winner, but I can't be far out. I'll tell you how I set about it. You may have noticed that chaps in the country with little places, 3 or 4 acres, are often very keen about them. In fact, the smaller the place, the keener they are. My frame-maker, who lives near Harrow, used to spend most of his Sunday afternoon sitting behind a curtain with the window open, listening to what passers-by had to say about the godetias in his front garden. His daughter sometimes sits for me, and she told me that if the compliments on the garden came in nicely, it put him in such a good temper that he used to let the family off church in the evening. I decided to work on the pride that the owner or tenant has in his place. I went down to the outer suburban belt, the part that they call the real country, and put up at a hotel. Then, bright and early one morning, I started out with my painting contraptions. I very soon spotted a place that I knew must be picturesque, because it had got some clipped yews and a sundial. Besides, as the gate informed me, it was called the Dream House, and that proved it. So in I went, pitched my easel halfway up the drive, and got to work. An old gardener came up and asked me if I knew that I was trespassing. So I gave him a shilling, my card, and my apologies. I told him to keep the shilling, and to deliver the card and apologies to his master as soon as that gentleman got down. That seemed to meet the case. In half an hour I had knocked off something showy, and then down the drive towards me came the owner, all smiles and Norfolk jacket, with a cocker spaniel trailing behind him. I gave him the sketch, and he was as pleased as Punch about it. He took me round the garden to point out other picturesque spots, and then brought me into the house to introduce me to his family. Nice people, very. Almost before I knew it I was breakfasting with them, and being hungry I was pleased to find that they took breakfast seriously. They'd have kept me there all day if I could have stopped, but the business of this problem required me to move on. At 12:30 I played the same trick again 6 miles up the road. Once more it worked perfectly. My hostess was an old lady of the almost extinct type that knows how to live. Everything about the place was just exactly. The luncheon was just exactly, and she gave me a very fine old Amontillado, a wine that we don't see enough of nowadays. I can't say whether it was the sherry or the success, but when I left I felt that I had got the club's cheque for £110 in my pocket, and was listening to the chairman's kindly words of congratulation. My mistake, of course. Begin well, but not too well. If you begin too well, mistrust it. At about 7 that evening I was painting a garden, which was really rather good in that light. I'd sent in my card and got permission. As I was finishing the job, and rather wrapped up in it, I heard a Scotch accent behind me, saying that the sketch was "no bad and verra like." He and I discussed the comparative merits of painting and photography. For accuracy he preferred the photograph, but then it didna give the colours. As before, I presented the sketch, and I still think that he was pleased with it. He asked me to sign it, so as to prove to his friends that he wasna lying when he said that it was by a professed painter, and admitted that he would not grudge the money it would cost for framing and glazing. He then said he made no doubt I would be hurrying home for my dinner, and he would wish me good evening. And so, in a manner of speaking, I fell at the last hurdle. Still, I suppose I score the breakfast and luncheon. The Honourable James Felden addressed the chairman. "I'd like your ruling on that point, sir, and it's quite impartial, because I am not competing myself this time." "Not competing?" said the chairman. "Might I ask what stopped you? Hitherto you have been one of the keenest and most sporting of our members, in spite of your air of lassitude." "What stopped me," said Jimmy simply, "was breakfast. Breakfast is bad enough at any time, especially if you've been rather late and busy the night before, but to breakfast with an absolute stranger on chance food, and to go out and dig for the invitation first, well, it was unthinkable. I'm sorry to spoil old Wildersley's score, and if he'd bunged me one of his sketches instead of chucking them about the suburbs, I might have been able to stifle the voice of conscience. As it is, I feel bound to raise the objection that he gave remuneration for the breakfast and luncheon, to wit, 2 sketches. The gift of the sketches was precedent to the meals, and was unconditional, as we see by the fact that the 3rd sketch produced no meal. The sketches were a lure, and the use of a lure is not prohibited. They were not remuneration given in return for a meal. I should not even say that the meals were remuneration for the sketches. They were merely an expression of gratitude. Mr. Felden's objection is disallowed. That habitual non-starter, Mr. Harding Pope, MP, was now asked if he had made his choice between competition or resignation. "I have competed, of course, but I have only the most dismal of failures to record. I was down at my constituency, and I picked out 3 new residents on whom I had a plausible excuse for calling. I phoned the first to ask if he could see me at 9, apologizing for the earliness of the hour. He said that the time suited him very well, and that, as a matter of fact, he always breakfasted at 7, so as to begin work early. The man whom I called on at lunch-time could only give me 10 minutes, he said, as he was lunching out. The third did ask me to dinner, but not on that day. And probably all 3 have put me down as a man who calls at tactless and inconvenient times. I can only say that I am ready to suffer far worse things for the privilege of retaining my membership." Sir Charles Bunford had perhaps shown rather more strategy, but had only 1 degree less of failure to report. He had obtained letters of introduction to 3 noted food cranks, all of them ardent proselytizers. To the first he represented himself as suffering from a list of symptoms. Sir Charles had memorized them carefully from the advertisement of a patent pill. He said that he was sorry to call at so early an hour, but after a night of suffering he had determined that he would begin on a new system of diet at once. "For instance," he said, "what ought I to have for breakfast this morning? What do you have yourself?" The food crank said that he would not only tell him, he would ask him to share his simple but healthful fare. At this point in his narrative the chairman interposed. "This is a case where the question of definition may arise. I must ask you to tell us, Sir Charles, what the food crank gave you for breakfast." "It was not so much breakfast as a premature dessert, with a hospital flavour to it. It consisted of uncooked fruit, and lessons in the difficult art of mastication. With that we drank a special sort of coffee, from which all deleterious matter, including the taste of the coffee, had been entirely removed. But the question of definition need not worry you, as I can't claim to have won. The second food crank whom I visited at lunch-time told me that his chief secret was never to eat in the middle of the day. The third, whom I tackled in the evening, was so ascetic in his conversation, and so extremely anxious to keep me out of his dining-room, that I formed a suspicion, perhaps unworthy, that the man's practice differed somewhat from his preaching. So I failed, but it was quite an amusing day." That great epicure Mr. Matthews had not competed, and gave his reasons with a solemnity that contrasted with his usual cheeriness. "Thank heaven," he said, "I have a sophisticated appetite. Thank heaven again I have an over-educated palate. Starvation for 24 hours I might have possibly faced, but the horrors of casual hospitality were more than I could risk. "Ah, well," said the chairman, "I must turn to Mr. Pusely Smythe, who is acting as secretary for us tonight. I presume he has added one more to his list of triumphs?" "The pangs of failure," said that saturnine gentleman, "are increased by the jeers of the learned chairman. I ought to have won. I claim to have won, but I confess that it will not surprise me if I am reduced to an equality with my artist friend. I shall have a melancholy pleasure in sharing the prize with him. He tried to work upon gratitude, and so did I. The particular brand of gratitude that I decided to exploit for my purpose was the gratitude that a woman feels for the return of her lost pet dog. It seems to vary inversely as the value of the dog, but it is always great. You will perhaps remember that about a year ago Leonard set us a peculiarly sinful problem, which he styled the substitution problem, and that, in the complicated and unjustifiable operations by which I succeeded in winning the prize, I made the acquaintance of James Tigg, and did him a good turn. Now James, known to his intimate friends as Kidney, is by profession a French polisher, but does not practise, and his favourite occupation is the appropriation of dogs, his gifts in that direction amounting almost to genius. I sent for James. I told him that I thought it likely that 3 ladies, living in different suburbs, would lose their pet dogs, and that I should know where to find them, and should be enabled by the address on the dog collar to return each of the little darlings to its owner. At the same time I put 5 golden sovereigns on the table. "Likely?" said James. "It's a ruddy certainty." He then picked up the coins in an absent-minded way, and instructed me as to details. 2 days later, at an early hour in the morning, I called on Lady Pingle at her house at Epsom with her ladyship's alleged Pekingese under my arm. I told her how I had found the poor little thing wandering on Wimbledon Common late the night before, almost in a state of collapse, had given it food and shelter, and had taken the earliest opportunity to relieve her anxiety by its return. Her gratitude was almost frantic. She kissed the dog ardently, and at one moment I was almost afraid she was going to kiss me too. She did not do that, but she did insist on my breakfasting with her, and I accepted. And let me tell that over-educated sybarite Matthews, with his sneers at casual hospitality, that he himself never breakfasted better. I lunched with Mrs. Hastonbury at her residence at Leatherhead. In this way she showed her gratitude for the return of Bimbi, a chocolate-coloured Pom with a short temper. But I must confess that she was not nearly as quick off the mark as Lady Pingle. I had to inquire about hotels in the neighbourhood before she saw which way her duty lay. The 3rd dog that I had to deliver, a mouldy little pug, belonged to the wife of a curate living much nearer home. She was grateful and she was hospitable. She said that they never dined, but that they were just sitting down to high tea, and she hoped I would join them. It was an evening meal substituted for dinner, and I contend that I am entitled to count it as dinner. "Kindly tell us what you had," said the chairman. "What, the internal evidence? Certainly. I had cocoa, scrambled eggs, and seed cake, and I hope you will take a lenient view of it." Your hostess herself maintained that it was not dinner, and the internal evidence, as you call it, entirely supports her view. Your career of crime will only give you a score of 2. The high tea is disallowed. I will now call upon Major Byles. "The sacrifice that I made to luck on the occasion of our last competition," said Major Byles, "has brought me success at last. I claim to be a winner, and await your decision with confidence. It happened that 2 of my friends both wanted a furnished house at Brightgate for the winter, and did not want the bother of going down to make their selection. I saw my chance at once. I might never have thought of it, but I didn't miss it when it was shoved at me. I said at once that I was thinking of running down to Brightgate for a day or 2, and that it always interested me to look over houses. They told me their requirements and let me take on the job for them. The house agent at Brightgate had only 6 houses on his books that were at all suitable. He gave me orders to view, and I started business at 8 one morning. I started badly. At the first house, a proud but pretty parlour-maid told me that it was not usual to show furnished houses at that hour, but I could call again at 11. At the second house there was only a caretaker. That left me with, so to speak, 4 cartridges and 3 birds to kill. I hurried on to the third house, which was half a mile away. By a bit of luck I met the owner on the doorstep and told him my alleged business. "You're very early," he said. "Why, we haven't had breakfast yet." "No more have I said. "But last year I lost a good house through being too late, and I thought I wouldn't make the same mistake again." He was a genial old chap. He said the best thing I could do was to come in and breakfast with him, and by the time I had finished the servants would have got the bedrooms tidied up. I did my best to accept with decent hesitation. At lunchtime I tried the 4th house on my list and struck another caretaker. I couldn't afford another miss. I got lunch at the 5th house, but I had to be no end complimentary before I could get them up to the point. In fact, it wasn't till I told the woman that her pimply-faced son was a fine upstanding young fellow that she decided to order the extra chop. But at the 6th house I had no trouble about dinner. The owner turned out to be a friend of mine. He fetched up a bottle of the 87 in my honour, and insisted on my stopping the night. They were all pukka meals, and all the conditions were observed. Am I a winner, Mr. Chairman? Certainly. Does anybody else claim to be a winner? I do, said Dr. Alden. The day before yesterday a doctor rang me up and asked me to see a patient of his, a woman with a wealthy, devoted, and very nervous husband. That was at 8 in the morning. My car happened to be at the door, and it suited me to go right away. I saw the patient, was able to reassure the husband, and had breakfast with him. Later in the morning a man was introduced to me who was interested in old glass, and had heard of me as a collector. He was very keen that I should lunch with him and see what he had got. He was a pleasant chap, and I accepted. When I got back, a doctor, quite an old pal of mine, said that he was going to take me to dine that night with a man I had never seen before. It seemed that the stranger had staying with him for one night a French specialist in my own line. The Frenchman was anxious to meet me, and his host was anxious to please him. So he had tried to arrange it through a mutual friend. I was myself keen to meet that Frenchman, and so he succeeded. Of course, I didn't arrange all this. Couldn't have arranged it. As a matter of fact, I had never intended to compete this time, but destiny decided to take a hand in this competition. I claim to be a winner. An interesting point, said the chairman. Can a man be said to win who has never competed? I shall decide in Dr. Alden's favour. Leonard says nothing of intention. He only demands certain facts. And these facts the doctor, by an amazing stroke of luck, has been able to provide. The prize of £110 will be divided equally between him and Major Byles, unless there is any further claim. No further claim was forthcoming. The chairman then announced that Mr. Matthews would preside at the next meeting, and read out the problem set for the following month, called the Win and Lose Problem, and there was a general feeling that it would take some doing. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of The Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Bounds. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. Chapter 4. The Win and Lose Problem. At the 46th meeting of the Problem Club, the waiters having left the room, Mr. Matthews, smiling and rubicund, took his place as chairman. He finished his glass of an old and veritable cognac, lit with care and a cedarwood spill a cigar that can only be obtained by the favour of the planter, and read out the terms of the win and lose problem. It is required to win an even bet of £1, resulting in a net loss of £1 to the winner, and to lose an even bet of £1, resulting in a net gain of £1 to the loser. No competitor is to make more than 2 bets. Well, gentlemen, said Mr. Matthews, I'm supposed to make 1 or 2 preliminary observations. Now, here's a thing that strikes me. You may remember that when we tackled the kiss problem, our reverend friend Mr. Cunliffe said that it revealed the artful Leonard as an apostle of morality. Of course, the Padre took the jackpot on that occasion, and so he may have been prejudiced, but it looks to me now as if he may have been right. See for yourselves. You've got to win a bet and lose money by it, and then you've got to lose a bet and make money by it. And at the end of it, you've left just where you were when you started. There's not much deadly fascination and excitement about that. Why, It's enough to make you lose your taste for gambling. Yes, and there's one more point. I noticed a great deal of preoccupation at dinner tonight. Very few of you seem to be putting your heart into the work. I believe I was the only man who had the vol au vent brought back to him for further reference. Great mistake, that of yours. Some of you tried to work out sums on the back of your menus. I detected Major Byles with corrugated brows in the act of making pencil calculations on the tablecloth. Yes, there's not a doubt that Leonard has given you a worrying time, and some of you are wrestling with it right up to the last moment. It won't surprise me if there's not a winner among the whole lot of you. However, we'll begin with a likely chance. You, Sir Charles, have got a reputation as a learned man. Can I ask the secretary to draw a cheque in your favour? I'd be sorry to stop you, said Sir Charles, but I'm afraid I can't claim it. Archaeology don't help with arithmetic. As an eminent classical scholar once observed, I've not got the low cunning that makes a mathematician. The only thing I could think of was to insure the chances of each bet appropriately. But it seemed to me that you would regard such insurance as being in itself a bet. I certainly should. You don't change a thing by changing its name. You are limited to the 2 bets, and I shall not allow 4, even if you call 2 of them insurance. Come now, Jimmy. Have you profited sufficiently by your racing experiments to have won the prize tonight? Profited by my racing experiences, said the Honourable James Feldane wearily. If you'd go and talk to the bank that has charge of my overdraft, you wouldn't use words like those. But backing horses, though it's a mug's game, is at any rate easy. There are too many complications in Leonard's fancy work for a simple child of nature like myself. I can't engineer a 2-cylinder gamble with a double back jump actuated by the camshaft. The only man I know who could face it without mental overstrain is my bookmaker. He's a wonder. He'll give you 15 different ways of perforating this problem inside a minute. No juggle with figures can beat him. I don't know if you'd call it a talent or a disease, but I've not got it. As a competitor, I've failed, but I don't mind admitting that I've made a little actual money out of the competition. Jimmy smiled reminiscently. May we have the details? Asked the chairman. I'd sooner you got them from Heseltine. The chairman called upon Mr. Heseltine. I don't wonder, said the young man, that Jimmy don't like to tell you. If I had stolen money from a crossing sweeper in St. James Street, I shouldn't be proud of it myself. The silly ass thinks he's scored off me, but as I was out to lose a quid anyhow... May we have the actual facts? Suggested the chairman. Certainly. I was thinking about this problem, and I got a sudden brainwave. I saw how to do the first half, to win a bet of £1 that would leave me £1 down when I'd won it. Well, I happened to be going up St. James Street with Jimmy later that morning, and by way of leading up to it, I asked him what he generally gave a street beggar. Nix, he said. What do you? So I told him that I generally gave a sovereign. He told me in his coarse sort of way that he didn't believe it. That was what I had expected. All right, I said, I'll bet you £1 that I give 2 golden sovereigns to the next beggar or crossing sweeper I come across. He thought about it, and then said, I'll take that, and to guard against accidents, I'll be the next beggar. Give me a little assistance, kind sir. Of course, in that way he put himself on velvet. Whether I decided to win my bet or to lose it, Jimmy had to make 1 sovereign out of me. Didn't affect me at all, for according to Leonard, I'd got to win my bet and lose £1 by it, which I did. The only person hit was the crossing sweeper up the street, who would otherwise have made 2 quid. Of course, what I ought to have done was to have handed Jimmy over to the police for begging. Wish I'd thought of it. Well, I negotiated the first half of the problem, but the second half beat me. I'm inclined to think the sting of the beast is in its tail. It takes 2 people to make a bet. I'm not a poet or any sort of imaginative chap, but I could think of a bet which for a dead certainty it would pay me to lose. I couldn't think of anybody, even including that rotter Jimmy, who would be fool enough to take it. You must try somebody else, Mr. Chairman. Major Byles, the chairman suggested. As a head waiter, said the major, I've got nothing against Leonard. As a setter of problems, he's given general satisfaction. But this time I should like to back my bill to the effect that he has mixed up too much arithmetic with the sport. I've spent a good month on this win and lose business, all the time with the feeling that a boy fresh from school would work out the whole thing on the back of an envelope in 10 minutes. And I've done nothing. I spent the first fortnight at home, and at the end of it I had contracted insomnia, headache, and what you might call pardonable irritability. At the end of that time my wife said that of course she had noticed the change, and that I seemed to be doing sums all day, and that if we were ruined I'd better say so and she would face it bravely. I reassured her and came to town on important business. I used tons of the club notepaper for my calculations, put an undue strain on the club wastepaper baskets, quarrelled with 2 of my best friends, was sarcastic in addressing the club servants, and am expecting a letter from the committee to ask for my resignation. The amazing thing is that all the time I have been on the very point of getting the solution. In my opinion, it's the most horribly worrying thing that Leonard has ever given us. Well, said the chairman, artists are not generally supposed to be particularly strong at arithmetic, but I'll ask Mr. Wildersley what he's done about it. Can't say I agree with the Major, said Wildersley. I call it a jolly easy problem, and I claim to be a winner. It didn't take me any time to think of it, neither. I got a man into my studio to see alleged works of art, and I said to him that I would bet him £1, I would give him £2. He took me. You've lost, I said, pay up, and then I'll pay up. He handed me a sovereign, and I handed him £2 of potatoes in a paper bag. So I'd won £1 in money, and lost £2 in potatoes. If you win £1 and lose 2, that makes a net loss of £1 on the transaction. And so I'd done the first half of the problem. The chap seemed to be grumbling rather. What's the matter with you? I said. The greengrocer told me they were the kind he eats himself, and that he could guarantee them. I don't want the beastly potatoes, he said. The whole thing's a dirty swindle. I thought he'd say that, so I told him it was no swindle, and I'd be willing to take the same bet myself. He jumped at it, but to make sure, he said he would bet me a sovereign he would give me £2. I took him, lost, paid the sovereign, and got back my £2 of potatoes. That finished the second half of the problem. I'd lost a bet of £1 and had made £2, giving the net gain of £1. Naturally, he wanted to know what I had done it for. I said it was to stop him from trying to talk about art. The chap's a critic. Mr. Matthews took 2 minutes and a brandy and soda before giving his decision as follows. Ingenious, but it won't do. Mr. Wildersley professes to have subtracted money to the value of a sovereign from £2 by weight of potatoes, and to have got a result of £1. Of what does that pound consist? Even after dinner we can't have mental confusion of this kind. The claim is disallowed. Mr. Harding Pope, MP, made an uninteresting confession of failure, and the chairman then called upon Mr. Quillian, K.C., who was acting as secretary for the evening. Mr. Quillian removed his pince-nez and glanced around the room with that look of amiable superiority that some people find irritating. I claim to have won this fairly simple competition, he said. Of course, it has a psychological as well as an arithmetical side. The bets have to be actually made and not merely worked out on paper. I made my plan one afternoon, and then went over to my club to see if I could find my friend Blenkinsop. He is generally at the club at that hour, and I felt sure that he would accept the 2 bets that I had to propose. Well, as it happened, Blenkinsop was not at the club, but I found Mr. Pusely Smythe alone in the smaller reading room. I've had to submit to a good deal of chaff, not particularly amusing, from Pusely Smythe, and by way of return it seemed appropriate that he should help me to win our £110 prize. Also, if he will forgive me for saying so, he has just the commonplace shrewdness that I required in my victim. After a little preliminary conversation, I produced my sovereign case. I told him that there was a certain sum of money in gold in that case, and that I was willing to bet him a sovereign I would make him a present of it. He said, as I knew he would, that this meant that the sum of money in the case was half a sovereign, and that in consequence he would lose 10 shillings on the transaction if he took the bet. Yes, I said, there is that possibility, but I am willing to protect you against it by a second bet. We will agree that the loser by the first transaction shall have the option to give the other man double what he has lost for double the sum now in my sovereign case. And I will bet you a sovereign that he will not exercise that option. You see how it works out. If the sum in my sovereign case is half a sovereign, as you suppose, you will lose 10 shillings on the first transaction, but you will win a sovereign on the second transaction by exercising an option to exchange 20 shillings for 20 shillings. Without taking the time to think, he accepted both bets. I then opened my sovereign case and showed him that it contained £2. I gave them to him, and as, by so doing, I had won my bet, he gave one of them back again. Kindly observe that I had now solved the first part of Leonard's problem. I had won an even bet of £1, the net result of which was that I had lost £1. Having made myself the loser on the first transaction, I now had the option to exchange twice my loss against twice the sum that had been in the sovereign case. That is, to exchange £2 for £4. I had bet that the loser would not exercise this option. I lost the bet and exercised the option. Thus, I lost an even bet of £1 with the net result that I made £1. This settles the second half of the problem. I await, sir, with confidence, your decision in my favour. Mr. Matthews referred once more to the terms of the problem. Yes, he said, it seems to me that you have met all Leonard's requirements. Very smart bit of work, in my opinion. You take the club cheque for £110. unless, of course, some claim to share it with you is substantiated. Is there any such claim? Naturally, there's mine, said Pusely Smythe, with his deceptive air of melancholy. Yours? How did you do it? My learned friend has just been telling you. I was going away for a brief and well-earned holiday, and I had decided to give the competition a miss this time. As I was sitting in the club studying a guidebook, in came Quillian looking like a thimble rigger who had just set up his little plush-covered table. He offered me his first bet. I put it aside. He offered the second, and he says I didn't take time to think. Thought with me does not take the prolonged period of gestation that it does in the case of the nobler animals, such as KCs. I thought 2 thoughts. The first was that Quillian was out after this competition. The second was that when 2 men gamble together, what one wins the other loses, and vice versa. That was enough. I took him. He won the first bet, but lost £1 by it. It follows that I lost the first bet, but won £1 by it. Similarly, when he lost the bet but won £1, I won the bet and lost £1. It's all very simple and elementary. I hope he's going to make a victim of me again soon. This time, without any effort on my part, he has shoved £55 at me. I have only had to take it. And I don't care whether it was benevolence or mental short-sightedness, I'm going to thank him just the same. The claim's allowed, of course, said the chairman. The thing that makes me mad is that I didn't see it myself until you pointed it out. It's obvious. It simply shrieks at you. My mind must be going. The menu that you devised for our dinner tonight, sir, said Pusely Smythe, was sufficient proof of the contrary. Those that study the recondite must sometimes find the obvious out of their focus. Thank you, said Mr. Matthews. I'll learn the last sentence by heart. It'll make a ripping excuse next time I do a damn silly thing. Checks were drawn for Quillian and Pusely Smythe, and the chairman then opened the envelope containing the problem that Leonard had set for the following month. It was titled The Handkerchief Problem, and on the face of it scarcely supported the theory that the ingenious Leonard was a great moral teacher. The Honourable James Feldane was reminded that it would be his duty to preside on the next occasion, and to adjudicate on this problem, which was as follows. It is required to steal as many handkerchiefs as possible from a member or members of the Problem Club. Violence may not be used, and thefts detected in the act will not score. Restitution will be made of the stolen handkerchiefs within 24 hours of the adjudication, but felonious intent is to be presumed in every case. Rotten luck, said Feldane to his friend Heseltine. I should have enjoyed working on this problem. It appeals to my natural instincts. I should probably have won it, and in that case might have given 1 or 2 of them something on account. And so this has to be the occasion when I'm shut out of the competition and have to act as chairman. Yes, said Heseltine. Nobody's so sure of himself as the non-starter. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of the Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. Chapter 5. The Handkerchief Problem. At the 47th meeting of the Problem Club, the chair was taken by the youngest member, the Honorable James Feldane. That weary young gentleman, having provided himself with a double portion of green chartreuse for the purpose, as he said, of supporting the dignity of the position, opened his adjudication a little informally. "Let's get started," he said. "The first job is to read out the particular teaser with which the wily Leonard has been worrying you poor old things during the past month. Here goes." The terms of the handkerchief problem were then read out. They were as follows: It is required to steal as many handkerchiefs as possible from a member or members of the Problem Club. Violence may not be used, and thefts detected in the act will not score. Restitution will be made of the stolen handkerchiefs within 24 hours of the adjudication, but felonious intent is to be presumed in every case. "I wish I could have been a competitor this time," the chairman continued, "instead of being stuck up here to give the momentous decision. I should have had some sport, and handkerchief sneaking falls nicely within my line of intellect. I might have scooped the prize. But as I'm debarred from scoring off you, I've taken jolly good care that none of you should score off me. For the past month every handkerchief I've used has been attached to the interior of the pocket by a steel chain and swivel, and those not in use have been locked away in a safe. My valet thinks I've gone off my head, of course, but then he'd have been bound to have thought that sooner or later anyhow. The great point is that not one of you low pickpockets has been able to get a handkerchief out of me. We will now pursue the inquiry. Hesseltine, are you guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty, my lord," said young Hesseltine cheerfully. "I may not be winner, but I think it would be safe to back me for a place. I struck early at our last meeting. As soon as this problem was announced, I slipped stealthily and unobserved from the room. I had rightly concluded that there would be no attendant in the cloak-room at that hour. If there had been, I should have sent him away to get me a box of matches. From the overcoats of members, I secured a nice little haul of 9 handkerchiefs. One of them, a silk bandana, the property of Major Byles, was big enough for 2 and ought to count as 2. "Might count 2 on a division, as they say at the elections," said the chairman. "But in the undivided state it counts 1. Anything further to say?" "That was my only coup. The only thing to add is that one of the 9 belonged to a gentleman who did not start keeping them in the safe quite soon enough." "All right," said Jimmy, speaking entirely sotto voce and ex officio. "I'll be even with you for that one of these days. Meanwhile, Mr. Matthews, it will be your painful duty as secretary to give that thief a score of 9." The chairman then called upon Mr. Quillian, K.C., whose story was connected with the story of Mr. Pusely Smythe. In both cases it was a story of failure. Both men had hit on precisely the same idea. Quillian called on Pusely Smythe at a time when he knew he would be out, but would be expected back shortly. He, as he anticipated, was recognized by the servant and asked if he would wait. During the period of waiting, Quillian made a swift and silent excursion to Pusely Smythe's bedroom with a view to abstracting his available store of handkerchiefs. But the chairman was not the only member who had taken the precaution of keeping his handkerchiefs in an unlikely place. Not one solitary handkerchief could Quillian find, and while he was thus engaged, Pusely Smythe had been calling on Quillian with similar intentions, similar practice, and a similar result. "You're both too clever to live," observed the chairman, "but you've cancelled one another for once. Mr. Harding Pope, as a politician, you should be familiar with the paths of dishonesty. How did you get on?" The member of Parliament gave a somewhat sickly smile. "I fear," he said, "that I have not competed. I represent a dissenting constituency, which is careful, almost to the point of being inquisitorial, as to my character and private life. Had I competed, it is easily possible that I might have been arrested. I could have explained, but all explanations come too late. It would have done me great injury. In the circumstances, I have decided to resign my membership of this club, and my resignation will be in the chairman's hands at the next meeting. I have enjoyed these meetings immensely, but I have been, and am likely to be, too often debarred from taking an active part in the competition as a member should. The delightful but unscrupulous Leonard asks too much of me. Should I ever find myself in a position of greater freedom and less responsibility, I shall certainly crave the honor of re-election." "Sorry," said the chairman, "I'm sure we all are, but the rules of the club do require that members shall be workers and not merely onlookers. If ever the political cat jumps the other way, and you're thrown out of Westminster into the cold, cold night, I make no doubt that at the first vacancy we shall welcome the lost sheep back to the nest. I will now call upon Major Byles." The major lived in the country. There were unusually good golf links in the neighborhood, and he was both a good player and a good host. He had used his opportunities, as he explained. "I worked on a system. I waited till my man was absolutely wrapped up in the game, meanwhile locating his handkerchief carefully. Then, at the moment when he was following the ball with the eye, I put in some swift finger work. It was not always successful. The doctor, for instance, bowled me out twice. He's got eyes in the back of his head. But I got 6 handkerchiefs that way, and a 7th from a raincoat that had been left in my hall. I've good reason to know that I'm not a winner, but it's not bad, eh?" "A good sporting game," said the chairman. "These thefts from the person ought really to count more than easy overcoat shots. They want more dexterity, the others only require brain work. Still, I have to administer the law as Leonard lays it down. So far Hesseltine wins." "But he won't win," said the major mysteriously. "Oh, yes, I've got good reason to know it," and he proceeded to compound for himself a due measure of whiskey and seltzer water. Dr. Alden, who was next called upon, could claim a score of only 2, but so far as it went, it was brilliant and audacious work. One of the handkerchiefs had been taken from Sir Charles Bunford, and one from Mr. Matthews, and in both cases the theft had been committed in Piccadilly in broad daylight and under the eyes of the police. "It's clear where your real talent lies," said Jimmy. "You're wasted in Harley Street. However, time's getting on, and a few bad men would like a rubber of bridge before we part. Will any member who claims to have beaten Hesseltine's score kindly hold up a hand?" The Reverend Septimus Cunliffe and Mr. Weldersley, A.R.A., both held up hands. "What!" said the chairman. "Our padre in the sneak thief business? Has he no respect for his cloth? Leonard has a lot to answer for. However, we will hear you, Mr. Cunliffe." "Leonard," said that broad-minded cleric in his sonorous voice, "has once more revealed himself as a great moralist. He has shown us that the thief, a bad man, must none the less have good qualities, and has taught us to differentiate the good from the bad. The spirit of adventure, the clever planning, the manual dexterity displayed by the thief are all worthy of praise. It is solely to his felonious intentions that we should take exception. Leonard has expressly provided that for the purposes of this competition the felonious intentions are to be purely imaginary. They are to be supposed. Consequently, I could approach the problem with a clear conscience, and I admit that in compiling a score of 14 my cloth has been of assistance. Suspicion does not attach readily to a man in clerical attire. To proceed to my story, one Saturday early in the month, I had been down to play golf with our friend the Major. By the way, you'll send me back my handkerchief, Major. Already in the post? Thanks. On leaving his house, I noticed at the back entrance a laundry van in charge of a sleepy-looking rustic. The name and address of the laundry were proclaimed on the van in large letters. My knowledge of the country showed me that in approaching the Major's house that van would pass an inn called the Royal George at a distance of 2 miles from the house, and a turning to the railway station at a distance of 1 mile. That made everything easy. On the following Saturday I was on that road 3 miles from the house. My boots were dusty, and I looked as tired as I could. I waited till the van came along, hailed it, and asked the driver to give me a lift as far as the station turning. He was not averse to making an extra shilling, and I climbed up. For the first mile I was talking to the man and making friends with him. When we reached the Royal George, I suggested that a pint at my expense would not come amiss to him, and that I would look after the horse while he was inside. He was good enough to say that I was a parson after his own heart, and handed me the reins. The horse did not need any looking after. It was not that kind of horse. In the interior of the van I explored a laundry basket, and annexed 14 of the Major's handkerchiefs. I had left them in the cloakroom for you, Major. When the driver came out, I was holding the reins and looking pensive. I stepped off at the station turning. "What is your decision, Mr. Chairman?" "Brainy piece of work, and a fair score of 14. My idea was that nobody would get beyond 15. Did you beat that, Wildersley?" That large but childlike artist smiled. "I claim a score of 144. Gee whiz! I didn't know there were so many handkerchiefs in the world. Which members did you get them from?" "I got the whole lot from you, in spite of the steel chain and the locked safe. But I have not got as many. It's an impossibility. However, let's have the yarn." "You'll find it's all right, Mr. Chairman. You young men are so careless that you don't know what you've got. Some time ago I had to execute a deed of gift, making over a rotten cotton picture of mine to a provincial gallery. Up to that time I didn't know the difference between a deed of gift and a hole in a wall, but you learn things as you go on living. When this problem was set, I saw that by a deed of gift and a small investment I could do myself good. My first step was to buy 12 dozen handkerchiefs, top quality and deucedly expensive. I had a monogram of the chairman's initials, excellently designed by myself, and embroidered by the shop on all those handkerchiefs. This having been done, I collected my parcel of lingerie and went off to my solicitor, who is of the old established 18-carat type. I told him what I wanted, and the shock nearly killed him. When he got better, I explained that it was a joke, but that it was essential in order to get the laugh that the deed of gift making over the handkerchiefs should be all correct, watertight, and copper-bottomed. He does not understand jokes, and will believe anything about them. So he engineered me a lovely deed. I then addressed the parcel to the Honorable James Feldane, and went off with it in a taxi to Jimmy's place. I deposited the parcel, with the address downwards, on a chair in the hall, and put my overcoat and hat on the top of it. I then went in and had a few words with Jimmy about a bridge problem. I had now made the handkerchiefs Jimmy's property by deed of gift. I had delivered them at his residence. It only remained to steal them, and that was easy. It's always easier to steal a thing if the owner doesn't know he's got it. Besides, as it was 11:30 in the morning, Jimmy's costume consisted of a bath gown, a Turkish cigarette, and a bad headache, which excused him from coming out into the hall with me when I left. I picked up my hat and coat and a parcel containing 144 handkerchiefs, the property of the chairman, and went off. He will find the parcel returned to him when he gets home tonight, and I should like his decision. Much obliged to you, Wildersley. It's ironical that I can make a bit as long as I'm not competing. All the same, the decision must be held up a moment. The fact that you've provided me with more handkerchiefs than I shall ever use this side of the silent tomb might influence my judicial mind. I must have a second opinion. Counsels, will Mr. Quillian kindly give us his views on this claim? I don't usually give opinions in this offhand way, said Mr. Quillian, but on this occasion I have really no doubt. The deed, sir, was duly executed, so we are informed. The goods in question were bona fide intended to become your property, and have in fact become so. They were delivered at your residence. In the absence of felonious intent, I should say that they had not been stolen, but the terms of the problem state that felonious intent is to be presumed. Your ignorance of the whole transaction does not seem to me to affect it. In your place, sir, I should have no hesitation in finding the claim good, and I only wish I had thought of the idea myself. I ought to have done. Thank you, Mr. Quillian. Then I decide that Wildersley is the winner. Mr. Matthews, will you please draw the usual check to Mr. Wildersley's order? This having been done, and the chairman for the next meeting appointed, Jimmy opened the sealed envelope containing the problem that Leonard, the astute head waiter, had set for the ensuing month. Jimmy read it to himself first. Well, he said, this is a new line of country. This is somewhat of a sensation. It's called the identity problem, and runs as follows. It is required to discover the identity of Leonard. The use of professional detectives and any communication with Leonard himself on the subject of this problem are forbidden. I always knew, said Hesseltine with conviction, that chap was no ordinary head waiter. And it appeared that several other members, who also had forgotten to mention it before, had always been of the same opinion. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of The Problem Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nat Gertler, Camarillo, California, USA. The Problem Club by Barry Payne. Number 6. The Identity Problem. The Reverend Septimus Cunliffe took the chair at the 48th meeting of the Problem Club. The problem which Leonard, the astute head waiter, had set the members to solve during the preceding month was simply the discovery of his own identity, and competitors were debarred from communicating with Leonard himself or from employing detectives in its solution. Mr. Cunliffe, with a pardonable enjoyment of his own excellent elocution, read out the terms of the problem in tones that almost made it a drama, and the few introductory remarks that usually fell from the chairman became, in his case, almost an address. True, the occasion furnished him with some excuse. Gentlemen, he said, with this meeting the Problem Club brings to a close the 4th year of its existence. The idea of the club, as I dare say most of you are aware, originated in the imaginative brain of Lord Herngill, and of the original members there are still 3 left us: Sir Charles Bunford, Major Byles, and Mr. Matthews. The eccentric nobleman who was our founder did not himself long remain a member. Broken in health and, as I understand, suffering from private disappointments, he relinquished his clubs and retired altogether from society. He spent the remainder of his days on his Yorkshire estate, shut out from the world and even denying himself the companionship of old friends. It was only a few months ago that his death was announced in the newspapers. A somewhat gloomy subject, gentlemen, but it seems to me fitting that on this occasion we should recall with gratitude the name of our founder. Now, for the first 2 years of the club's existence, the monthly problem was always provided by the member whose duty it would be to adjudicate on it, but during the second year it was found that this did not work well. Some of the members had not sufficient readiness of invention. Others did not show sufficient discretion. Our minutes of the period show some problems, I grieve to say, that can only be described as scandalous. Under these circumstances, a member, Mr. Barstairs, since dead, was deputed to find for us some able and trustworthy person who, for a small honorarium, would act as our setter of problems. At the next meeting he announced that he had selected Leonard, who had then just become head waiter here. The selection of a head waiter for the purpose seemed to some of us, certainly to myself, fantastic, more especially as Barstairs offered no explanation at all. But we must admit fantasy plays some part in the spirit of the club, and no formal objection was raised. Time has shown that Barstairs had reason in his fantasy. Leonard has given us every satisfaction. Whoever he may be, I think that we are agreed on one point, that he possesses qualities unusual in a head waiter. In fact, gentlemen, the news that I am about to give you will, I am sure, be received with regret. I have a letter from Leonard, in which he tells me that after 11 tonight he will cease to be in the service of the hotel, and will no longer be available as our problem setter. He offers, if it would be any convenience to us, to name a successor whose ability and discretion he can guarantee absolutely. I may add that it is a very properly expressed and respectful letter. The appointment of a successor may, I think, be considered later. Let us now proceed to the adjudication of the current competition. I confess that if I personally had to find out who Leonard is, I should not, under the conditions imposed, know how to begin. However, I have great confidence in the ingenuity of the 10 members before me. There would have been 11 but for Harding Pope's resignation. The chairman's confidence was misplaced. Every member had made an attempt to solve the problem, but every one had failed. Several of them had hit on the expedient of following Leonard when he left the hotel. The Honourable James Feldane, for example, had hit on it and recounted his failure. I lay up in a taxi a few yards from the door of this place, where I could get a good view. Presently out came Leonard, and I might very easily have missed him, for I was expecting him to bob up from the basement, and he came out of the main entrance. He was well turned out, and looked rather less like a head waiter than I do myself. He called up a taxi and got in. Off he went, and off I went after him, my driver having been instructed. We drove, as near as I can guess, for about umpty-ump hours. I know I began to wonder if my cigarettes would last out the trip. Then my cab slowed down to a crawl, and I looked cautiously from the window. Leonard's cab had stopped in front of a mouldy-looking place with big gilt letters on it. He overpaid his cabman. I heard the words "thank you" distinctly. Ran up the steps, rang a bell, and entered. I got out. "Cabby," I said, "where are we? Is this the hereafter?" "No, sir," he said. "Looks like it, but it's really Brixton." The big gilt letters informed me that Leonard had entered the Boulou Temperance Hotel. I pushed the push, and the door was half opened to me by an Italian waiter with the darkest eyes and hands I ever saw. I could catch a glimpse of a small hall furnished with a good deal of dust and a stand for hats and coats. I spotted Leonard's excellent hat and overcoat thereon. The waiter looked at me suspiciously. I got right on to the point at once. "I want," I said, "the name and address of the gentleman who came in here just now, and I'll pay a sovereign for it." He seemed to understand the argument. In a minute he was back with the name and address and the information that the gentleman was stopping there for only one night. He got his sovereign. The name he gave was Leonard, and the address was the address of this hotel. I may have been more annoyed in the course of my life, but I doubt it. So I made the weary journey back again, had a light supper of 1 whiskey and soda, and went to bed. Mr. Matthews had followed Leonard on foot to the Ritz. Mr. Quillian had tracked him to a desperate hostelry in the far north of London. Major Byles had pursued him to an hotel in Wimbledon. They ascertained that he spent a night at each one of these 3 places, but they added nothing else to their knowledge of him. Sir Charles Bunford had been no more successful, but he had a curious story to tell. He had met Leonard by chance in St. James Street one night at 11:30. There was nothing in Leonard's dress or bearing that suggested anything less than complete independence. Sir Charles felt certain that he himself had not been recognized, turned, and followed him. "He led me," Sir Charles recounted, "up through the squares to Oxford Street, where he turned west. Just then there came shuffling along in the gutter toward us a street vendor with a tray of little toys slung from his shoulders. He gave the impression of an old man. Leonard and he both stopped. I also stopped, making a pretense of lighting a cigarette. They were both in the full light of a street lamp, and I had a close view of them. Leonard picked up from the tray a little monkey of blue plush mounted on a pin. Deliberately, and without a smile, he stuck the monkey in the gutter merchant's battered bowler. Then he took out his note-case, produced a $5, and spread it on the tray, and walked on. During this curious incident, neither of the men spoke. As you may imagine, I tackled the street vendor at once. "You're in luck," I said. "Did you know that customer?" He folded his $5 and slipped it into an inner pocket. He looked at me shrewdly, and I noticed that his eyes were young. His voice, when he spoke, was quite young, and it was the voice of an educated man, too. "Which of us," he said, "can say that he knows the other, or even that he knows himself?" "Come," I said, "I think you can tell me what I want to know, and 2 $5 are better than 1. "That is so to some people at some time, but not to Mr. William Bunting, the editor of the Pig Keeper's Friend. At this time I will wish you good night, Sir Charles." And he walked off briskly, without a trace of the old slouch. How he knew my name I can't tell you, for certainly Leonard, even if he knew I was following, never said a word to him. The man left me staggered. I rushed off again after Leonard, but I had lost him. That is all I have to tell, and I have given you the facts accurately as they happened. I was both sane and sober at the time, but if you doubt that, upon my word, I can't be surprised. The failure was general. Dr. Aiden had interviewed the proprietor of the hotel, who was most courteous, but, in the doctor's opinion, lied in his profession of ignorance. Mr. Pusely Smythe got hold of one of the other waiters, who appeared perfectly willing to betray anybody on the most moderate terms, but unfortunately had no information to impart. "Well," said the chairman, "I must decide that the problem has not been solved. The prize for its not being awarded, the prize for the next competition is doubled. We have now to obtain the solution of the problem from the wily Leonard himself. At the same time, he is required to show us that the problem was possible of solution by us. It is now 20 to 11, and presumably Leonard leaves this hotel at 11, so we have not much time to spare. If you, Mr. Quillian, will unlock the doors and ring the bell, I will tell the waiter that we should be glad to see Leonard for a few minutes." But it was Leonard himself who answered the bell. He was a tall young man of good figure. He had not the stereotyped version of good looks, but his face was pleasing and full of humor and intelligence. He carried himself well. His dress was unsuited to the occasion, for he wore a well-cut lounge suit of dark blue cloth, and his brown laced boots suggested a product of Bond Street intended for use in the country. There was no trace of a waiter about him. His manner was easy, confident without being assuming, and marked just by that touch of restraint that a man might show on first introduction to a number of his equals. "Well, Leonard," said the chairman, "we were on the point of sending for you. Your problem has beaten us. Can you show us how we might have solved it, and provide us with the solution?" "Certainly," said Leonard. "I'd rather expected that I should be wanted." "Good. Now sit down, won't you? We're all quite informal here." "Thanks," said Leonard. It seemed to be tacitly and generally accepted that he had become a guest of the club. Dr. Aiden proffered his cigar case. Jimmy brought him a whiskey and soda. "I think I ought to begin," said Leonard, "by apologizing to you for having given you all such a lot of trouble, more especially as it was quite intentional on my part." "Part of the game," said Major Byles. That's all right. No apologies needed. Thanks very much. At any rate, I can apologize for these clothes. The fact is that I'm going north by the midnight train from Euston, and so I changed. And now, let me show one or two ways in which the problem could have been solved. Some of you followed me when I took a taxi to an outlying hotel and subsequently made applications at the hotel. If instead of doing this you had hailed the taxi that I had just left, you would in each case have found inside it an addressed envelope giving you the information you required. When Mr. Feldane went to that very long drive to Brixton, I intentionally left my hat and coat in the hall of the alleged hotel for a few minutes. He examined the waiter. If he had examined the inside of my hat, he would have found a certain clue. Sir Charles very nearly caught me. That night I left the hotel much earlier than usual, and had satisfied myself that nobody was waiting for me outside. I was on my way to a house in Audley Street, where I was not known as the head waiter at this hotel, and my identity would probably have been discovered, and it was necessary that I should go to that house. At the top of St. James Street I found that Sir Charles was after me, but I had taken a precaution. A friend of mine was stationed in Oxford Street, masquerading as a vendor of penny plush monkeys. I found him, and we went through a little eccentric pantomime together that had been prearranged. As had been expected, Sir Charles stopped to make inquiries from him, and while that was happening, I made my escape. "One moment," said Sir Charles. "How on earth did he know who I was? You never spoke to him." "No, I never spoke." "And he did not know who you were. He did not know that you were Sir Charles Bumford, and does not know it now. He knew that he could address you as Sir Charles, and he knew that from the fact that I stuck the monkey in his hat. It was a prearranged code. If Major Byles had been following me, I should have stuck the monkey in my friend's right sleeve. He would then have addressed him as Major, though he would not have known his name. If Mr. Wildersley had been after me, the monkey would have gone into the left sleeve. My friend would have known by that sign that he was an artist, but would have known no more than that. Similarly, in other cases, he would always have appeared to have known, but would not have known really." "Leonard," said the chairman, "in my opinion you have shown both skill and discretion, and a good sporting spirit besides. I decide that your problem was fair. And now, will you solve it for us?" "Very good. I must give you some abbreviated family history. My grandfather had 2 sons, both of whom disappointed him, though in different ways. My uncle was a man of extreme avarice. My father, the younger of the 2, was a gambler. Both my parents died before I was 5 years old, and I, the only child, passed into the charge of my grandfather. My grandfather placed me with the family of an intimate friend of his, who was also the senior partner in the firm of solicitors who acted for him, a Mr. Barstairs. Barstairs had married a Frenchwoman. French was the language generally spoken in their house, and most of my early years were spent abroad. I went through a public school in Cambridge without any particular disgrace or distinction. So far, my grandfather had kept me well supplied with money. In fact, at Cambridge I had not spent my allowance, but I had never seen my grandfather. I wrote to him 4 times a year, and his replies were always witty and entertaining. I took everything for granted in the way that boys do. On my 21st birthday, I had a letter from my grandfather to the effect that, as an experiment, he wished me to make my own living in any way I liked for a period of some years. When that period was over, or sooner if he died before then, I was to be no longer under that necessity. Mr. Barstairs, who had not been consulted, was indignant about that letter, but I did not resent it myself. What assets had I to offer an employer? My classical degree would have entitled me to teach in a school, a truly awful profession to my mind. I spoke 2 continental languages well, and a 3rd passably. I had an unusual knowledge of wines and cuisines for a man my age. Mr. Matthews will remember that Barstairs was an epicure. I had seen a good deal of hotel life at home and abroad. I took counsel with Mr. Hance, the proprietor of this hotel, who was known to me. After some training at an hotel in Paris, I became the night head waiter here, using my first name, Leonard, as my surname. My grandfather and Mr. Barstairs alone were taken into my secret. It is to the latter that I owe the pleasure of having served a club of which I should be proud one day to become a member, if that were possible. I saw life from a novel and interesting angle. I had my mornings free for poetry, to which I am devoted. I was quite satisfied. There is little more to add. In the year that I came here, my uncle died unmarried. 3 months ago, my grandfather also died, and I— "Pardon me," said Sir Charles, "but I have been watching your face carefully, and I think I see a family likeness or the trace of one. All that you have said would confirm it. I think you are the grandson of the founder of this club. In that case, you are the 6th Baron Herngill. That is correct. I remained here for these months while some legal matters were completed, and to oblige Hans, for I consider that he did me a good turn. I leave for Enthwaite tonight, and now, gentlemen, since time presses, may I mention that I have a successor to myself to propose to you, if you have made no other arrangements. He would act on the same terms as I have done. I will answer for his ability and discretion. He is, like myself, a poet. He is also the editor of an obscure weekly publication called The Pig-Keeper's Friend. If you choose him, I have here his first problem to deliver to the chairman. His name is William Bunting. With your permission, I will retire for a few minutes while you consider this. When he had gone out, it was found that every member of the Problem Club had formed the same idea. On his return to the room, Lord Herngill was informed that Mr. Bunting had been appointed, and also that Lord Herngill had been proposed by the chairman, seconded by Sir Charles Bunford, and unanimously elected a member of the Problem Club. End of number 6. Recording by Nat Gertler, Camarillo, California, USA.